Welcome to How to Create a Federal Compliance Program. Oh, that worked. Okay. The music had everyone going. Okay, my name is Yolanda Williams Favors. I am a contract and regulatory compliance attorney with Atkins North America, Inc. And we're going to have Jennifer Ross Amato, who is a Senior Vice President with WSB. And then we're going to have Shana M. Van Hoften, who is a partner with Hanson Bridget. So we're going to start out with how to create a compliance program, federal compliance program, which I'm sure that everyone is very excited about. This is our table of contents. I'll talk about what I do with project initiation, then I'll talk about the compliance program, and we'll talk about crucial regulatory areas. For project initiation, there are some things that you should do before you even begin working on your compliance program. The first thing is you need to scrutinize your agency, because there really is a big difference between if you're writing for an agency like WMATA or MARTA, agencies that have bus, rail, streetcars, all kinds of things going on, or if you're writing for an agency that is a small commuter bus agency, or like I've done one for the Atlanta Department of Transportation, and they basically just concentrate on complete streetscape projects, resurfacing, and that kind of thing. So you really need to know who your audience is. Attorneys are known for writing things that are too complicated, and we really don't want to go through writing a compliance program for everyone to say, this is too complicated, I don't know what they're talking about, and it goes and sits on a shelf and you never see it. Because with that, you're not giving value to your client, and that's really what attorneys are all about. The next thing is you want to identify your various funding agencies, FTA, FHA, FHWA, FRA. They all may have different regulations, and you don't want to write something, of course, that is in conflict with your funding agency. So you need to really understand your funding agency, that your agency is more apt to obtain funding from. Analyzing federal, state, and local, everyone has their own laws. So you don't want to write something that completely and totally conflicts with the laws, with your state or your local laws. Even your agency, I was doing one for a very small agency. I drafted this beautiful violations, you know, what they do, how you do it, what happens, and came to find out that they already had that. They had an Office of Inspector General. It was already done. So I wasted a lot of time, so you have to be really careful about what laws your agency may have. Knowing your laws and regulations, of course, you have to be careful. For instance, with FHWA, local governments are not a direct recipient. They go through the Department of Transportation for the state, who's a pass-through agency, and your local agency may be a subrecipient instead. So you really have to know and understand those kinds of things. Then you have best practices. Best practices are your friend. They make it a lot easier to understand. And we'll go through it in a minute, I use the guidelines and FTA handbook a lot because they really break it down for you very easily. And for best practices, you don't have to just concentrate on best practices for transportation. I use a lot of best practices from other industries in the best way to establish a compliance program. So before I start the compliance program, I determine the technical capacity of the agency that I'm dealing with. Because again, you have to understand your audience and you don't want to draft anything that may be too complicated. And the way that I do that is by issuing a survey. Now, the best kind of surveys are the ones that you do online because it makes it easier to manipulate the data once you get it. But if you're dealing with a small agency, a good old Excel spreadsheet will do it. Of course, I send it to my graphic artists so that they make it look all nice and pretty and inviting, because you really do want the people to answer the survey. With the survey, I ask questions like, why do we have a compliance program? Do you know the laws? Do you know the regulations? Do you have adequate resources? To really get an understanding of what their experience has been with compliance. I ask yes, no questions. I ask the questions, agree, totally disagree, don't care, really, really agree, and just to make it more interesting and not very boring. And then you want to make your answers anonymous because you really want people to feel free in order to answer your questions. Another thing I will do is I will do a project charter. With the project charter, that means that I know what I'm doing for executive management. They understand. So with that, I'll include the purpose. I'll include some sort of executive summary that will give the status of compliance in the organization and what's been done up to this time. I'll give my methodology and my key findings. And again, with all of these, I use a graphic artist to make it interesting, especially if it's going to executive management. You want it to look really good. The next thing I'll do is I'll do the assessment report. For the assessment report, I'm taking the data and I'm giving it back to the client, letting them know with each question what was said, what were the percentages, how many people said this or that, in order to really give them a good understanding of the status of compliance in their organization. Next, we'll get to the compliance program. And this is just sort of a very short outline of what I may have. I'm an attorney that if I don't have to draft it from scratch, I don't. So I will do a lot of research to try to go out and find something that is similar to what I have, and I can at least use it as a template to begin what I'm drafting. So I did do a lot of research on federal compliance plans for public transportation projects. Not a lot out there. Not a lot out there. And the ones that are out there, like I found one for WMATA, and it was like 150 pages. So I think I did find something at APT that I've included in my materials. But try to go out and see if you can do a lot of research. Worst case scenario, call me and I'll send you what I have been able to find. So in your compliance plan, you're going to start out with your introduction. And the whole purpose is to create a culture of compliance within the organization. So you want them to know why you have the compliance plan. What is the purpose of compliance? Give them a policy statement from your organization with regards to compliance. Everyone in the organization is responsible for compliance, from the CEO to the project managers to the inspectors to the people that clean your trains. Everyone is responsible for compliance, and you have to make it easy for them to report something, see something, report something. Now, the bottom line is the objectives for the compliance program, and those include policies and procedures, because if you don't have policies and procedures, they don't know what to do. They don't know what to follow, so you have to have those in place. You need to have a governing and reporting structure for compliance so that as it moves up, if something's pretty simple, who's going to handle that? Maybe the compliance manager. But if it's something that could be very detrimental to the organization, you need to have in there how the levels of authority is what I call it. You need to know who's managing, monitoring, and enforcing the compliance plan program. You need to have a reporting structure, a communication structure. Of course, you need to have training so people will know what they're supposed to do. And then you need to include how you're going to respond to the violations. So there are a lot of regulatory authorities. Like I said, you have to look at your state, federal, state, and your local authorities. But to me, on this slide, the most important one is knowing and understanding your agency's relationship to the funding agency. Because you can be a recipient, a sub-recipient, a direct recipient. There are all different kinds of relationships. And in order to really establish your plan, you need to understand that. You also want to include and understand your particular funding agencies, what their procedures are for non-compliance, because they're different from agency to agency. Okay, so now we have our laws, our regulations, 49 USC 53. It contains most of the federal transit laws, and then the ones down at the bottom are the various authorization acts. The most recent, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which a lot of people call the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and it goes through 2026. Then you have your regulations, you have your FHA regulations at 23. Whoever drafted 2 CFR Part 200 is a genius. I mean, I love it because it's the way that it's organized, and if I need to know something, it's so easy to go to that regulation, and it's just set out exactly what I need. So if you're in here, good job. You did a good job on that one. And then you have 1201, which is FTA adopting 200. 24, you have USDOT adopting the Real Estate Relocation Assistance Act. And then down at the bottom, 23 CFR Part 771, that is the policies and procedures for FTA, FHWA, and FRA to implement NEPA. You then have FTA circulars, and you guys are lawyers. I don't want to tell you anything that you already know, but yes, your recipients do have to follow circulars. Circulars basically explain regulations or fill in where regulations may be silent on something, and then every year you're going to sign your certifications and assurances indicating that you agree to follow these circulars. You then have your guidance documents, which are good, really, really good. And yes, you have to comply with your guidance documents. You have the master agreement, which details all the terms and conditions of the recipient's agreement with FTA. You then have the guidelines. The guidelines are for major capital projects, but a lot of time within that book, it will say, this is basically for major capital projects, but it is also good for any type of project that you're doing. So I use that a lot. And then the handbook I use a lot. It's really, really good because it's drafted for agencies that it's the first time you're doing a project or you have little experience. So I've used the handbook quite a lot. Then you need to, and I'll discuss these in detail later, but you need to have your oversight and governing authority for compliance. You then need to look at what types of project teams you have. There's a big difference in a compliance program when you may have 50 people working on a compliance program and you've got 20 project managers who've had their PMP for 20 years. Or when you're working with a smaller agency and you may have 4 people working on a project and you have a bunch of project managers who are new, don't have their PMP. So that's a totally different type of compliance program. So you need to look at the size and complexity of the agency, what sort of resources they're going to need, whether it's a new start or they've been doing this for years and they know what they're doing, and the needed staff and the technical capacity of the staff when you're drafting the plan. So the first, and I call this person the primary oversight designee. But it's really the person who's over the compliance manager, who's over the compliance program. So this could be a VP or a commissioner. It just depends on depends on your particular agency. And this person is is going to be over the compliance manager. They may appoint your compliance committee members. They authorize funding for the compliance program. This person is very important. They review the reports, and they may be your liaison to executive management. Because if you're doing this, you need to be able to report to executive management the status of your compliance program, whether or not it's working, and if you're having a lot of compliance issues. So this is the person you would go through for that. Next, you have your compliance manager, and I chose her because I think she's so cute. She's so cute. So your compliance manager is the person that oversees your compliance program. They establish your rules and procedures. They oversee the day-to-day operations. They're going to communicate with your stakeholders. They oversee the training. They make recommendations with regards to violations, and the biggest thing that they do is they keep up with the rules, laws, and regulations so that if something does change, like our laws never change, they have to update the compliance program because you always want to make sure that the version that you have is current. Lastly, they will interact with the third-party contractors to make sure that that you have your declaration stating that they will agree with either their compliance program, which you have approved, or they will agree with your compliance program. The compliance committee, whether or not you have a compliance committee depends on, again, the size and the complexity of your agency. The compliance committee can act in a governing role over the compliance manager, or they can just be in an advisory role. It's very good to have subject matter experts on your compliance committee because they'll be making decisions and recommendations, and they need to know what they're talking about. The compliance manager would most likely chair the committee, and with any committee that, I'm a regulatory compliance attorney, so anytime I establish committees, I believe the committees should have bylaws, they should have agendas, they should have minutes that they follow, because number one, 5 years from now, if someone comes back to figure out why you made this decision, it's in the minutes. And it's also good for lessons learned for future projects. And your compliance committee could also benefit from training in the future as laws change so that you make sure they know what's going on. So you then have your communications. If you're going to establish a culture of compliance within your organization, you have to communicate it to all the stakeholders. You have to talk about it at all the meetings and send out bulletins and let them know that the organization is concerned about this and is doing something about it. So your compliance manager would normally be the person who would liaison with all of these different stakeholders. Compliance is, like we said, everyone's responsibility, and so you need to get that information out, but you also need to have an open door policy because people have to feel free. If they have a question, they have to feel free to be able to come to the compliance manager or their supervisor and say, I think we made a mistake. We may not have done what we were supposed to do without fear of retaliation. So you have to create that kind of an environment within your organization. So with your communication, you're going to have communications with agency personnel. You can have minutes from your compliance committee depending on if it's sensitive information. You're going to be updating your compliance program. Your compliance manager is going to do annual reports or quarterly reports depending on what the person who is over the compliance program is asking for. You also have your normal organizational channels, and what I mean by that is your meetings. Everyone's meeting all day long about everything. We have meetings to figure out what we're going to meet about. So with all of those meetings, have a compliance moment. Or if something new has come out and the compliance manager has issued a bulletin, then you need to talk about that bulletin to say, hey, we've been having problems in this area, and this is the corrective action plan that we've put in place in order to solve that problem, in order to get feedback from your frontline people. With the contractor, the compliance manager needs to be able to speak with the contractor to make sure they're in compliance. But I have the chain of command system because they would need to go through the project manager, because you don't just want your compliance manager going rogue, you know, and running around speaking to people. And then your compliance manager should be your point of contact with your regulatory agencies for compliance matters. Of course, they would contact the project manager and say, I'm having these issues. So monitoring. The regulations do require monitoring. That's 2 CFR 200.39. Monitoring is ongoing throughout the life of the project. It's in regular intervals, whether you want to do it daily, monthly, weekly. I would suggest not daily, or you'd go insane. And FTA, and I keep talking about FTA because that's where I primarily work, but in all of FTA, FHWA, and FRA, they state that you have to monitor, but they're not specific about how you do it. They're very flexible. And so that allows you to tailor it to your particular organization. The purpose of monitoring is to make sure that the policies and procedures that you have in place are being followed, so that you can say that the project is going to be able to achieve its objectives. You then have auditing. The purpose of auditing, sorry, is you want to make sure that your compliance program is operating as it should, and that the project controls that you have in place are adequate. So it took me a while to sit down and figure that out, but the difference between monitoring and auditing is very important. So auditing, it can be internal or external. However, if it is internal within your organization, it needs to be someone that's not working on that particular project, because you want to avoid conflicts of interest. And then you also need to be concerned at the bottom about the Single Audit Act from 2 CFR subpart F. If you get more than $750,000 from the agency, then you will have to submit your single audits. And then you have your violations. Like I say, this is a sore thumb for me because I did all that beautiful work writing that violations provision for my client, only to find out that they had one. So, but when you're doing violations, you need to, how you're going to handle violations, you need to be very, very specific. You want to have various channels for people to be able to file reports: email, in-person, virtual, hotline, and you want them to know that they can do it without fear of retaliation. If they feel, the whistleblower thing, if they feel that their boss or someone can find out that they reported them, they're not going to do it. They're not going to tell. And finally, you have to have very detailed investigative procedures. I always suggest that you interact or coordinate with your HR department, because you want to be sure that you're not violating anyone's legal rights, or, as you're investigating them. And the last thing is, with the discipline for the violations, it's very, very important that you be fair and consistent across the board. You have to be very sure that a VP is not treated any differently than a person who was supposed to inspect a bus and just didn't do it. So you have to be careful about that. So your policies and procedures, you can't have a policy and procedure for every single thing that could possibly happen within the organization, but this is just a list that I make sure that I always have at a minimum. And training, you have to determine how you're going to train. If you're reestablishing an entirely new compliance program, then you may want to say all your designated employees have to take this within 90 days after it's been accepted. You then will have new hires, say new hires have to take it within, if you give it quarterly, within 3 months of being hired, and then everyone should take it at least annually. And that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And so now, I'm going to have Jennifer.